my best not to cough into the microphone. But yeah, all right. So I'm back this week, and I'm still working on recovering. But we are back in the book of James, and continuing on in our study here. We should hopefully be concluding shortly. This morning we're looking at chapter 5, verse 12, and the honest truth. The single command, the single call to honesty that James has for us in this verse. But as we're thinking about that, I'm going to start with a thought, which is, why do we need contracts? We live in a very litigious society. Everything is focused around contracts. Everything has a contract. Everything has an agreement that's written out in detail, that's signed by both parties, often has to be notarized or recognized by a witness, a third party to that. Why do we need contracts in absolutely every part of life? And it comes down to the fact that we're all liars. Humanity is so untrustworthy that from the youngest age, children recognize their need to make promises. Children learn to lie very shortly after birth. It doesn't take much. As soon as they begin interacting with people, they realize that they can get away with certain things, or at least they think they can. And shortly after that, they realize their need for promises. How young were your children? How young have you come across kids who feel the need to promise when they tell you they're going to do something, or that they didn't do something? It's very, very early in life. Oaths, promises, contracts, these become a part of who we are because mankind is so inherently dishonest. Jesus makes it clear where this comes from. It comes from sin. It comes because we are by nature children of the devil, who Jesus calls the father of lies. This, of course, is set opposed to God, who is to be our Father. God, who, Paul points out in numerous places, cannot lie. God, for whom truth is a part of his nature. Because God is truth, sin is inherently dishonesty. Though there might be an element of truth in every lie, it's always twisted. This is why oaths, promises, contracts are so necessary part of life, such a necessary part of life, because man is so dishonest. And to find an honest man, to find somebody with absolute integrity, is such a rare thing in our world. It's worthy of being upheld, worthy of being highlighted. Now, as we've been going through the book of James, James has been giving these proofs of faith. What does genuine saving faith look like? We saw perseverance in chapter 1, where we looked at good works and the way that it serves in chapter 2. Godly wisdom as opposed to pride. The need for humility in chapters 3 and 4. And the need for humble love for others in chapter 5. And really what James is doing here in chapter 5 is summing up all of his statements throughout the whole book. He's making his closing points here in chapter 5. We looked 2 weeks ago at verses 7 to 11, where he summed up his ideas really from chapter 1, looking at perseverance. How do we persevere? How do we be patient as we look for the coming of the Lord? And in verse 12 here, he's kind of summing up everything else. It's a summary for our speech, a summary for the way that we interact with others, a summary for the way that we live with humility and not pride. And that is in the way that we live with integrity, live with complete honesty. We're going to read verses 7 down to verse 12, just to give us the context here as James is kind of summing up his letter. Let's read that together. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets, who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. Above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or with any other oath. But your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. The point that we're looking at this morning is a simple one, and yet an incredibly difficult one to live out. That genuine saving faith will be lived with honesty and integrity that is above question. Genuine saving faith will be lived with an honesty and integrity that is above question. That's kind of the idea in his statement there, beginning verse 12, above all. But above all. This is not saying that everything else he said is unimportant, simply that this kind of concludes or tops off all that he said concerning our interactions with one another. Our life on a horizontal level as we're dealing with other people. Again, in chapter 2, we saw the importance of, not showing favoritism and serving those in need. In chapter 3, he focuses on controlling our tongue and our speech, that it's to be with kindness, the way that we speak with other people. In chapter 4, he's looking at keeping our desires in check as it comes to other people. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts? Our desires that wage war. And we also need to make sure that we're keeping our pride in check, that we don't abuse those less fortunate than us, that we don't hold ourselves above others. And in verse 12 here, he's kind of summing up all of that interaction, all that you do on a horizontal level, everything that you do in interacting with other people needs to be lived with complete honesty, absolute integrity. There should be no need for oaths. No need for contracts, no need for promises in your life. He gives the command, do not swear by heaven or by earth. This is really a reference back to the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, if you remember all the way back to Matthew that we went through a long time ago at this point, and you think about the book of James, much of what James has been teaching here is simply going back over what Jesus has already said. Much of what James has talked about is simply repeating. In fact, there are several places where he repeats word for word what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And we see another example of that this morning. I'll just remind us shortly here. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is speaking about oaths, about promises, about the need for integrity. He says in verse 33 again, you have heard the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond this is of evil. Now, in this, as James is alluding to, Jesus was using the traditions of the Pharisees to expose their false faith. A faith based on works that had no love for God or His Word. A faith in their tradition rather than in God. A tradition that Jesus accused them elsewhere in Mark chapter 7 of invalidating the Word of God. The Pharisees had built up a lot of different traditions around the Word, around the law, because they held the letter of the law as utmost important. And their works-based faith, their self-righteousness, I am good enough for God by following all of the rules, was taken and abused, as all things are, by man. And it was understood and then built up. In the end, what the Pharisees did was follow the letter of the law, but through their tradition destroy the spirit of the law. We often do the same thing, but this is a good example. They understood, the Pharisees understood the letter of the law, and even created more laws around it, so never to cross the line. They knew where the line was, and they wanted to make sure that they never even got close to it. So they put boundaries around the line, and then they built walls around the line. And in doing that, they ended up making a bridge where they could go right over it without ever feeling like they did. They knew the command in Numbers chapter 30, where it says, if a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word, and he shall do according to all the deeds that proceed out of his mouth. So what they said is that an oath to the Lord, an oath to God, you had to fulfill, following that command. And then they created a system of oaths, because man, being dishonest, still needs a way out. Still needs a way to make an oath, but not have to fulfill it. Still needs a way to lie. And so they started creating this system where they had different levels of sincerity based on what they swore on. We're not going to go into the whole system and all of the details. Jesus gives us a little bit of that picture just in mentioning heaven or earth or Jerusalem or even your own head. What they swore by dictated basically how faithful they felt they needed to be to that oath. Swearing by the temple was important. Swearing by the altar was more important. Swearing by heaven was even more important. But they also had even more back and forth systems where they could trick the people who weren't in the know. Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, as he's condemning the Pharisees, pointed this out, where he says in verse 16, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? They even created these systems where those in the know would swear by the temple. And for the Gentiles or someone who didn't understand would go, okay, that seems really important. That you would swear by the temple, but they knew that that oath didn't mean anything because the temple was simply a place of worship. But the gold, which was sanctified, was set apart. That was what was really important. And so if they swore on that, it was even more meaningful. In the end, it's all ridiculous nonsense. It's all systems to get around what they didn't want to fulfill. And Jesus points this out. And again, back in Matthew chapter 5, goes even further in pointing out that nothing you own, nothing you have, can hold you to your word. You have no control over any of these things. You can't swear by heaven because that is God's. It's his throne. You can't swear by earth because that's his footstool. You can't hold yourself even by swearing on your own head because you have no control about making a single hair black or white. And no, dying it doesn't count. Nothing you have can hold you to it because all belongs to God. And in the end, any oath you swear on anything is owned by God. And therefore, you're swearing by what belongs to him. You're swearing by God. This whole system, the whole trying to find different ways is meaningless. Because ultimately, you're still swearing by God. And that's what James is pointing to here. Saying to swear neither by heaven nor by earth, or with any oath. Because there's nothing you can swear on that doesn't ultimately make you swear before God. To have God hold you accountable to your oath. There is no way around it. There is no system you can use to get yourself out of those oaths. They're ridiculous. They're pointless. God's standard is absolute truthfulness. And that is the call. You shouldn't need an oath. Don't swear by heaven or by earth or with any oath. Now, James is not saying that oaths in and of themselves are sinful. Though some people have taken it that far, there have been groups through the years that have made a point of never swearing any oath, whether that be to a nation, to a king, even in a wedding ceremony. Refusing any sort of oaths because of this. That's not what James is saying. In fact, God himself swore an oath. Condescending to man, God made a promise. Paul talks about it in Hebrews chapter 6, where he says, "For God made a promise to Abraham, and since he could swear by no one greater than himself, he swore by himself. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with an oath given as confirmation, it is the end of every dispute. And in the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us." God promised Abraham to fulfill what he had said he would do. And because God can swear by himself, his own head, his own person, because there's nothing higher, nothing to hold him accountable, nothing even above him, he swore by himself. Making sure that man would understand the importance of his promise, God swore an oath. So James here is not saying that any oath in and of itself is sinful. I'm not saying don't ever sign a contract, don't ever make a promise. But what is the point? The point is God's standard of absolute truthfulness. That there should be no need for an oath. And that's what James gets to here. But your yes is yes, and your no, no. The standard of God's truth should apply in every single point of our life. Should be lived out in such a way that no one needs you to make a promise. No one needs you to sign a contract. No one needs you to pinky swear, to place your hand on a Bible. When you say yes, the answer is yes. When you say yes, then you're going to do it. And there is nothing that you need to do to be held accountable to that, because people will know that it'll happen. There are no shades or degrees of truth. It's either true or it's not. Your yes means yes. and no one has to question it. Your no means no, and no one has to wonder whether or not there is any lie. This is the idea, the standard of truthfulness that God places on his people, because that is God's standard of truth. There's no need for an oath, no need for a promise, because there is absolute truthfulness. We need to understand as believers, there is no such thing as a half-truth. A half-truth is a full lie. There is no such thing as a white lie, a meaningless lie. God has never lowered his standard for absolute truthfulness. And therefore, as a citizen of his kingdom, you are called to that same level. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to be brutal with the truth. There are times, as we talked about back when we went through the rules of communication, where remaining silent is not a lie. And we need to understand that truth, in and of itself, can also be used to be dishonest. We brought up that discussion, the honest truth. That's why I titled the message that we can use the truth in a dishonest way. My favorite way of explaining or putting on a resume, changing a light bulb. I don't remember the whole quote, but implementing a environmental illumination system with no overhead cost and no injury or no safety concerns. What'd you do? I changed the light bulb. We can be honest and still mean to deceive. God has called us to absolute honesty. To not even use the truth as a way to deceive. People should see us as an open book. We should wear the truth out in the open, such that every yes they know means yes, and there's nothing else behind it. Every no means no, and there's nothing else to wonder about. That is the standard of honesty that God calls us to live. And we live that way that you may not fall under judgment. Again, this is another warning. We saw a similar one back in verse 9. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. What is James warning about? The idea here, being judged, is the idea of being condemned. It's the word that's used for a guilty verdict. You are condemned. You are declared guilty. And your punishment, your sentence will be carried out. What's the warning here? The warning is that our lives, if they are not lived with that level of honesty, will face God's judgment. It's a warning that if there is someone who is living without this level of honesty, you need to be worried. James's point throughout this entire letter is to warn people. What does genuine faith look like? It perseveres. It doesn't fall away. It is lived without favoritism, not focusing on the rich or the influential. It is lived in good works, in service towards those around you. It is lived with honesty. It is lived with godly wisdom. And if you don't have these things, you need to be worried. If your life is not defined by these things, maybe you need to be worried. Maybe you don't have genuine saving faith. Maybe you have dead faith. Maybe you have worthless faith. And so again, James warns, if your life is not lived with this level of integrity, if people question your word, if people really need you to sign that contract before we move forward, then maybe you should ask a very important question. A question of your own heart, a question of your faith. Is it real? Because genuine saving faith will be lived out with honesty and integrity that is above question. So the first question I have this morning is, how can we sometimes take shortcuts or play with the truth? We know that lying is wrong. That one's an easy one.
Saying that, yeah, I'll do it, but I never said when.
Yeah, there you go.
Today, could be 10 years from now. But I said I'd do it eventually. That's not how it should be intended.
Did you hear that, by the way? Said I'd do it. Never said when I'd do it. The dishes will get done, I promise. Eventually we'll need new ones. So again, using the truth, yes, I will do it, but with a hidden meaning.
To imply agreement by not disagreeing, but then when you're really called on it, well, I never agreed to that.
Oh. So feigning agreement,
Yeah.
nodding along. Oh, I didn't say yes, I was just nodding along. I think everybody, some point or another, plays the lawyer, where they get the wordplay in there. One of my favorite things as a child, and now as an adult, I realized this didn't work nearly as well as I thought it did. I didn't throw the ball, I tossed it. I didn't hit my brother, I swung my arm and his face got in the way. To play word games.
In other words, in change meaning, I can't think of it right now, but there are a lot of ways the meaning gets changed. But we choose them carefully. Oh, that's interesting.
What about if we just don't say anything, and we know the truth isn't being spoken, or we choose to withhold truth? I don't know, it seems like it could be dangerous.
That is a line that we have to be very careful with. There's a time for not sharing truth. There are lots of things that in counseling, because of confidentiality things, I don't need to share with anybody. But not sharing those things is not the same as hiding the truth. And so we need to know when is the time to simply not share versus when we're hiding the truth, which is just as much a lie.
I'm going to say that with my mother and her living situation the way it is now, my sister-in-law says I've never lied so much in my life. But, you know, you're dealing with somebody with an altered reality.
Mm.
And so what she thinks is true, so you kind of distract her from it. But you can't really just tell her the truth because that would upset her probably even more than she already did.
So where on our line here does that fall? That's a difficult one.
Yeah. Because sometimes people's altered reality needs to be straightened out. Different from what you're dealing with. And sometimes people just, what planet are you?
think we need to be careful as well as we're looking at this question and understanding what truth is. We need a solid definition of truth, because the world today loves to play with the definition of things. And the definition of truth is one that gets changed from one person to the next, because truth so often is treated as relative. My truth is different from your truth. And that's something we need to understand. There is only one standard, one definition of truth. The one I've been working with for a long time is truth is reality as defined by God. And understand that we can't play with truth. There might be different feelings, and your feeling about something, it's true to you, that feeling. But that doesn't change reality as defined by God. So, in the same way that the Pharisees loved the letter of the law and openly broke the spirit of the law, we need to understand there are many areas in our life where we might follow the letter of the law while actively and intentionally breaking the spirit of the law. What might some of those areas be?
Trying to decide, like, is it really loving to not tell you the truth right now? I mean, valuing the relationship with this person horizontally rather than the relationship with God and His truth.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of those opportunities that, like, when do I get to say something?
Sticking with the truth and understanding that line. When do we share? How do we share? Where does it become a dishonest withholding of the truth?
But in Garnet's situation with her mom, the letter of the law, we shouldn't lie. But wouldn't it do more harm than good to tell her the truth that, yeah, you're gonna go home, soon. That's a lie, because she's there. But in the spirit of the law, she is home, So how could that be wrong? But I don't really understand the question, how could doing no harm, I guess it's fibbing, saying that she's gonna go home, but that is her home. She just doesn't understand that that's her home. So how is that wrong?
Okay, so going back to the issue of truth and fibbing, white lies, lies that are meant to be helpful to everybody involved. Is that still sinful? I would make the argument that the answer to that is yes. I believe, as God is absolute truth, there is no opportunity in which lying is not, or is acceptable. You can take that to extremes, and there are lots of examples of it. We have the biblical example of somebody like Rahab. So, not Jewish, not a follower of God completely anyway, though she became part. She's in the city of Jericho, right? And the two spies are in the city of Jericho, and the soldiers come knocking on her door, and she hides them in the attic, and she lies and says, no, they're not here. There's more recent example, the people who hid Jews during World War II from the Nazis. There's a great story in The Hiding Place of another family that were hiding Jews, and the woman lived with absolute truth in her life, lived this out completely, and the Nazis came knocking on her door, and they hid them underneath the dining room table, under the floorboards. The Nazis come in the door, and she asked, are you hiding Jews? She said, yes, they're hiding under the table. And They laughed at her and left. Now, is it okay to lie in that instance, to save someone's life?
You take it to the extreme, you can still trust God to hide them from their eyes. It's like smuggling Bibles past the guards going into a closed country. You just pray, and God blinds them.
Hmm?
And the instances where he opens their eyes and they see it, then they're seeing the word of God. And you may end up in jail for a time because of it. But Paul helped people to meet Jesus when he was in jail. So, I don't know.
I think it is, there is a, as we mentioned, there's a line between this idea of absolute honesty in the sense of I have to share every bit of information all the time, which is not helpful. Again, in counseling and things like that, there's lots of things I know about people because they have revealed it to me that I don't share in circumstances even where that information might be helpful to the person that I'm talking with. But it was said to me in confidence, and to betray that is, I think, a sin. So not sharing that truth is one thing, but lying about it is something else completely. And there have been times where I have to say, I know the answer to that question, but I cannot share it with you. That's not lying. That's not hiding the truth. That is confidence or confidentiality. But when we're dealing with somebody with dementia, can we lie to them and it not be sinful? I think it's a dangerous game to play. I'm gonna have to let you deal with that one yourself.
You know,
We usually just blame the doctor.
There you go. That's fine.
but back to Michelle's question, there are times where I know that someone needs correction, but this is not the time. This is not the time to have that conversation. So is my silence a sin of omission in that, not correcting them in that moment? It takes a lot of prayer, moment by moment, in some relationships to know, do I speak now or do I keep silent now?
Is there a black and white, the letter of the law versus the spirit of law? What's the difference between the two?
And I think that's the issue right there when I say that honesty, absolute honesty. The idea is not, again, you have to be, never stop talking and only ever speak truth all the time. There are times where being silent and not sharing is acceptable when you're not doing so in a way to be dishonest. But I think to openly lie, even if it is to help somebody in some way, is still lying. And I would argue that that's something we should, because it's so easy to make excuses. Oh, this doesn't hurt. Yes, the dress does look really nice on me. Who's that hurting? Well, you're still lying. And in the end, that person may catch themselves in the mirror and go, no, this looks horrible. And even though you were trying to help, trying to be nice to them, you still lied.
The one that I have troubles with is when someone has a medical diagnosis that is terminal and they are not told, you are going to die. And then pretending that they're getting better. I can't pretend that somebody is getting better when they're
So how would you, number two, that question, how would you ask it in a different way to understand letter of the law and spirit of the law for a 13-year-old or myself? I can understand the question a little bit better, like to wrap my mind around it.
I've kind of approached this question with like in a parenting sense of when we teach our kids to obey for the sake of obeying, where it's like you obey because I said so, versus when you go to the spirit of the law and you get to break down more like why do we obey in this way. why did God give us this command? And so that's more of the why behind the obedience versus just obeying because the law is there.
So, yes,
I
that,
think the letter of the law and spirit of the law, they're just confusing, you know.
okay.
That's all.
No, fair enough. So the letter of the law is, what does the rule say?
Yep.
So the rule says that you, I don't know, okay, speed limit. The rule says the speed limit is 65 miles an hour. Okay, so does that mean you cannot ever go past 65? Well, technically, yes. But there might be a time where it's necessary, you know, if somebody's dying, you gotta break that. Is there a time where 65 is too fast? Well, absolutely, we get ice all the time. What is, the letter of the law is do not drive faster than 65 miles an hour on the road. The spirit of the law is drive at a safe speed. And so when it's icy, when it's foggy, you can get pulled over, and now there are other laws on top of that, but to say the intent of the law is to drive at a safe speed. That's the spirit of the law. The letter is 65. The spirit of the law is drive at a safe speed. So it goes back to, as CJ kind of points out, it's the idea behind why follow the rule. So if I'm talking with a bunch of high schoolers and we're talking about this kind of question, this hypothetical comes up a lot when it comes to dating. How far can you go physically? Can you make out? Can you make it to second base? And then it becomes sinful. What is, if you have the letter of the law, which says you cannot do this, you can very much break the spirit of the law very easily. The intent is to say there should be absolute purity in your relationship. Well, how far can I go? No, then you're asking for the letter of the law, which the rule is, and as a youth pastor, I've had this, you're not allowed to any public displays of affection, in youth group in any of these events. And what I told kids to aim for was no one should know that you're dating. If they didn't know already, nothing should so how far does that go? How far again, we're looking at the spirit of the law. And so that's
And Jesus
the
took it
difference.
further. Jesus said, man looks on the outward appearance, man looks at the heart. And Jesus said, what you do in your heart is already sin.
Yes. So that's what I mean by that. The spirit of the law is what is the intent behind it. So Jesus, again, yes, laid that out. And the letter says, do not kill anyone, or you'll be liable for the courts. So as long as I don't kill anybody, then I'm fine, right? No, because as, again, Jesus laid out, if you look at somebody with hatred in your heart, then you're just as guilty. So, spirit of the law, stop hatred in any way, shape, or form. Letter of the law is just don't kill them.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Not that I have the answer now, but.
No, that's all right. So when it comes to those areas of honesty, when it comes to those areas of truth, we need to very much be focused on the spirit of the law above the letter, because nowhere in Scripture does it specifically say, thou shalt not lie. The commandment in the Ten Commandments is actually, thou shalt not commit perjury, if we were to use a more exacting term. But it goes to the spirit of the law. The spirit of this point is the absolute truthfulness of God. God, in whom there is no lie. God, who is truth, is to be our example, is the one that we are to follow. And therefore, I think to lie in any form is to go against the very character of God.